Thank you. It's such an honor to be in conversation with these three women who I greatly admire, having read your books in these past few weeks. I'm tremendously excited to have you all in conversation with each other, given the various themes of your work. So I'll give a brief introduction, and then I'll pass the stage over to them to talk a little bit to read a short passage from their books. So first, we have Rachel Khong, who is the author of Real Americans, and also Goodbye Vitamin, which was the winner of the California Book Award for First Fiction. Her work has appeared in the New York Times Book Review, The Cut, The Guardian, The Paris Review, and Tin House. In 2018, she founded The Ruby, a work and event space for women and non-binary writers and artists in San Francisco's Mission District. She lives in California. To her right, we have Crystal Hana Kim, who is the author of the critically acclaimed novels The Stone Home, which is a current finalist for the Maya Angelou Book Award, and If You Leave Me. Kim is the recipient of the 2022 National Book Foundation's 5 Under 35 Award and the winner of a 2017 PEN Robert J. Dow Short Story Prize for Emerging Writers. She lives in Brooklyn, New York with her family. And finally, we have Madeleine Watts, who is the author of the novels Elegy Southwest and The Inland Sea, which was shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Literary Award and the Glenda Adams Award for New Writing. Her nonfiction has appeared in Harper's, The Guardian, and The Believer, among others. She was born and raised in Sydney, Australia, and after over a decade in New York, she currently lives in Berlin. So if you wouldn't mind maybe starting with Rachel, just giving a very brief summary of what your novel's about, and then read a paragraph. Or you can skip the summary if that makes you uncomfortable.
I'm actually so bad at that, despite the fact that my book has now been out for almost a year, and I should have the elevator pitch by now. I like to say that it's a book about how we become who we become. And there are 3 characters, and they're all sort of coming of age in a way, but it's a lot of maybe different genres smashed together. And should I read a little bit right now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'm just going to read from the very, very beginning, and it will be such a small amount of reading. And you know, in writing classes, they always tell you never to start with a character waking up. I'm starting with a character waking up. And you have to read the rest of the book to find out if it was okay. This is 1999. My alarm rang at 7, and I pressed snooze as usual. The second time I awoke, it was still 7. This happened occasionally, these blips in my existence. I got blank stares whenever I tried explaining them, so I didn't anymore. The feeling I had was that time wouldn't move. A second would refuse to pass as it usually did, and I would find myself trapped in a moment, unable to progress beyond a minute or 2. My bathroom mirror, flecked white with toothpaste, reflected me to myself. Lines from the pillow were pressed into my cheek. I ran my fingers over the indentations. The toothpaste flecks gave the effect of being in a shaken snow globe. And I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you for being here. I'm the author of The Stone Home. So The Stone Home, I find it really hard to describe a whole novel because it's like everything the writer is interested in.
That's why they wrote a whole book.
Yeah.
Instead of a sentence.
But the way that I would describe The Stone Home is it's set primarily in 1980 South Korea, and it focuses on a 16-year-old girl named Unju who is forced into a reformatory center with her mother. And it's the story of them trying to figure a way out. And alongside their narrative, there's also the story of Sangchul, a 16-year-old boy, and his brother, who are already in the reformatory. And their narratives will kind of weave together as the novel continues. And that the center is based on real history. In 1980 South Korea, the South Korean government, who was run by a dictator pretending to be a president, wanted to win the 1988 bid for the Olympics. And so he secretly sanctioned these institutions to clean up the country's image. So I'll stop there, and I'll just read a tiny, tiny bit. This is the opening. The night my mother and I were stolen, we had been in an alley outside a go-go club in Konsan, the air thick and gritty with cigarette smoke, studded with the scent of stale beer and dried squid. She's sick, I need money, please. Amma gestured to me, squatting by a slick sewer grate. I wore sneakers that had once been white. The cracked rubber base let in a wash of rainwater, my sockless feet puckered and raw, my laces gray and frayed but bowed. I pinched the skin above my ankle, hating her for using me, hating that we needed it. If I pinched 100 times without complaint, she would get enough money for a meal. I was up to 87 when the police came. A net of curses, pelting, arms swatting arms, a rock I tried to slash across the men's faces. Our wrists grabbed tight behind our backs. In the paddy wagon, Amma screamed and screamed. I'll just stop there.
Nami? So Elegy Southwest is, I also feel like I have trouble condensing it. It's two stories, basically. One of them is about a road trip that's happening in 2018 between a couple who you learn you start to see their relationship come undone and fall apart. The woman in the couple is like me, Australian originally, and has moved to the US and is super interested in the Colorado River. And her husband is from Arizona. And so they're driving through the Southwest along the course of the Colorado River. And so you're learning and thinking quite a lot about the history and future of the Colorado River as it is affected by climate change. And you see the two stories sort of interweave and interact with one another. And shall I read? I'll also read a little bit from the beginning of the book. Afterwards, you told me it was part of what you loved most about those weeks. You got up every morning and you just drove, with only the vaguest sense of where we would be sleeping that night. You didn't have to make any decisions, and you didn't have to think about what you were doing each day. I sat beside you, navigating from the map on my phone, even when we were out of range. My left hand nearly always held onto your thigh. I didn't know how to drive. You collected the car. I sat on the bench in the waiting room of the airport Hertz office, listening to the final notes of a Charlie Brown Christmas soundtrack, then rocking around the Christmas tree, although it was a little over a week before Thanksgiving. 6 days until I turned 29, though by my birthday, we'd have crossed through Nevada and California and entered Arizona, according to the itinerary. You didn't know it was on the itinerary because it had been me who planned the trip. You said you would drive me wherever I wanted to go. When you'd collected the keys and signed the forms, we found the designated car in the lot and made our way out. It was almost midnight by my body clock, but 9 o'clock on Pacific time. I watched the city draw near in the window. The yellowy glow across the valley floor cast the big desert sky a dark purple. Las Vegas, a valley of artificial light, ringed by the black shapes of mountains. Billboards stretched all along the Las Vegas freeway. Absinthe, opium, Celine Dion and the Backstreet Boys. Report prescription opiate abuse. Great cannabis deals next exit. Palm trees everywhere. There's something fucked up about Vegas streets, you said. We'd been to Las Vegas before, but it was the first time you'd driven a car there. I don't know now whether it was the streets that were fucked up or if it was the feeling you had, ever present, that there was something fundamentally fucked up about this big southwestern desert you never felt comfortable coming from.
So that excerpt is a particularly good segue to my first question about place. These novels are embedded not just in a place, but in the very idea of place. From the quickly drying up American Southwest to these claustrophobic concentration camps in South Korea where distance is measured in terms of mere steps. While, Rachel, your novel takes issue with the whole concept of America, this sort of terribly resistant melting pot. So I'm curious, how did you set the parameters of the places that you wanted to examine, and what details felt crucial in bringing them to life? Maybe I'll start with Madeleine.
For me, it was very, very specific. So I was mapping things down to the street. I was making sure that everything exists in real life. And in fact, one of my editors actually mapped the entire road trip. It looks crazy, but it does sort of exist. And that was really important to me particularly because I was telling a story about climate change and about a place that's changing very quickly. I think there is a kind of memorial approach to the book, and it's a book very interested in grief and loss and climate anxiety, I guess. And so it was really important to me to be very, very specific and capture the reality of these places in the Southwest that the book is set in 2018, and even now those places are going to be different. The water levels change, the sort of what land is available also changes, and so that was quite specific, that it was important to me to be very, very specific about everywhere, especially also because when I was writing the book, and when I first started, it was the pandemic, and I was in quarantine, and I was definitely not in any of the places I was writing about. So every day I would sit down, I was there imaginatively, but I was never in the Southwest while I was writing.
Crystal, do you want to go? Or? Yeah, I mean, place was so important to this book in particular because, as I said, it's sort of about how we become who we are, and I think place really shapes us, right? There's this question in my mind of, why am I a writer? You know, if my family hadn't immigrated to America when I was 2 years old, would I be a writer today? And I have no idea. I don't know the answer to that. I know that it feels so essential to who I am, but it's also probably like a product of growing up as this like lonely kid in Southern California and going to the library all the time and reading a ton of books. And I know it, emerged there. Would it have come if I had, just grown up somewhere else? So that was a question that was huge for me. And so in my book, it's, each character is sort of being raised in a different context, and their stories are different but also overlap. And I think that those contexts both shape them, but they also get to decide who they want to be. There is agency, right, and who they eventually become. But yeah, place is always so interesting to me because it is a huge part of who we are, and places are so distinctive. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's why I'm interested in Korea, even though I was born here in New York, because who would I be if I lived there is something that I think about a lot. For the Stone Home, I couldn't really decide the place once I decided to write about this real-life historical incident because I had to place it into a reformatory center. So the novel was, I decided to write this book after speaking to a survivor of one of these real-life institutions called the Brothers Home. And I spoke to him in Korea, and he shared his story with me, and that is really what compelled me to write this book. I knew, though, that I didn't want to place my novel in the Brothers Home because I didn't want to take away their voices. The survivor Han Jong-sun is doing a lot of important activist work in Korea, trying to get recognition and reparations. So I wanted to create a fictionalized version. And then I think for me as a writer, the question was, how do I create places of refuge within this institution for the characters? So for Eunju and her mother, they live in one of the buildings called Little House, and I created that as a community for the women, where they do have a little bit of distance. And then there's the big house and the grounds. So I was very much thinking about place, but on a tight micro level, and I wanted to get that sense of claustrophobia onto the pages for the reader, but also figure out ways of giving them a reprieve. So there is this actually a bookend set in 2011, and the novel actually opens with a Korean American woman arriving at older Eunju's home with a knife, and she says, "My father gave me this knife and told me to find you to return the knife to you in exchange for the truth." And I have these two women in 2011 talking throughout the novel, and I thought that would be a good way to bring in a larger landscape of Korea and also give people a reprieve from the claustrophobia of the reformatory center.
Yeah. So my next question is about love. Rachel, you're dealing with a lot of intergenerational baggage, mothers who betray daughters, who then betray sons, all of whom are seeking some kind of forgiveness. And Crystal, your mother and daughter are locked in this terrible proximity, both reliant on each other and also a little resentful of each other. And Madeleine, you're dealing with two young people whose romance is fraying at the edges. Could you talk about how these books affected your understanding of love? When it's good, what it can withstand?
I think that could be the whole panel, honestly. I don't know. Love is a very huge topic. I mean, I love that you brought that out as, just like a substance in all of our novels, because I do think, for the most part, we write out of love, right? We write because we love it. And I think for me, something that I sort of came to later on in the novel, there's one character in the novel she is born and raised in China, but she immigrates to America, and she has a lot of this like American-style ambition. She's really believes in individualism and meritocracy, in this chance to make something of herself. And she sort of lived her whole life wanting to achieve and like wanting to prove herself and wanting to do that at all costs, right? Sort of at the expense of other relationships. And I think that's something that I was so raised with as an American, just this idea that it was so important to achieve and do well professionally, or just just be useful somehow, or like prove your worth as a human being. And I think through writing this book, I mean, not just through it, but like alongside writing this book, I was sort of learning that that's not how to value a human being. It's not about what we do, it's more about just the fact that we exist at all and we're just here, like everyone gets to belong. And so, late in the book, this character, May, is sort of realizing that she has tried to like minimize all the interruptions, all the distractions in her life. But that's what relationships are. They are interruptions and they are distractions, and maybe you aren't gonna get to your destination as quickly as you'd like to, but like the interruptions are just like the messy human stuff, and like that's, I don't know, that stuff is really beautiful too. So I think that's kind of what I came to. Yeah.
I love that. For me, the mother-daughter, there's a strong mother-daughter story in here, and there was a strong mother-daughter narrative in my first book. So with my second, I thought I wouldn't go there, but I can't seem to help myself. And I think it's because I think it's such a complex, fraught relationship, and I just have distinct memories as a teenager getting into ferocious fights with my mom and feeling like she does not understand me. And then now I am a mom, and I feel like daughters are often the harshest critics of their mothers, and so that's something that I'm really interested in exploring on the page. And so with Unju and her mother, they're put into the Reformatory Center together, and her mother has raised Unju to be really ruthless and independent, right? But in this center, Unju is 15, 16 during the period of the book, and so she wants to get, she's rash, she's impulsive like a teenager is. She wants to get out no matter what. She wants to be reckless in the way that she finds escape. And then her mother, who's a little older and a little more cautious, and her method of protection is to try to blend in and be as invisible as possible within the institution in the hopes that they can kind of work their way out. And I thought that would be really interesting to have these two characters that are fighting with each other, but it's really rooted in their love for one another, right? They want to protect each other, they want escape, they want safety, and it's just coming out in these different ways. And that is like a big thrust in the novel because mother-daughter stories are so, I think, essential to the way that I think about the world. And I learned with the writing of the second book that I can't avoid it, I can't avoid it in the fiction.
Yeah. When did you become a mother in the process of this?
I became a mother after my first book before this came out.
Okay.
So I have 2 kids now. So that really changed the shape of the book, too.
Yeah.
I think that when I started thinking about what this book would be, I knew I wanted it to be a love story. And I wanted it to be a love story that captured all of the complexities and complications of a relationship that I think is often not present in our minds when we think of what a love story is. So I wanted this to be a story of 2 people who don't hate one another by the end, and where there's no villain, basically. Like neither of them are doing well, and they can no longer love one another in the way that they need. But it's nobody's fault. And I think that was particularly interesting to me because I was the daughter of people who had like an incredibly acrimonious divorce, and so I grew up with this idea that it's always somebody's fault, and that's not been my experience of my relationships. It's like much more complicated than that. But the other thing that was sort of present in my mind when I was writing this was that part of the dynamic of this couple is that Eloise, the woman in the relationship, like me, is Australian, her husband is American, and part of loving him is also loving and coming to understand what America means to her, because this is a country she has chosen partly out of love for somebody else, and it's something that, like him, she had a choice in. And those, I was very aware of sort of thinking through, as I was writing, like, what was my relationship to America, what were the things that I loved about America, even as there are things that, I find really difficult about America, and, frightening and other negative adjectives. But I think that I really wanted to present a relationship where it's also a love story, but also the connection to place is so deeply entwined with the love story itself.
Yeah. And all of these relationships that you're talking about, there's a sort of stark honesty to them that eludes our traditional understanding of, sort of a happier, rose-colored version of love. Like, you're getting into the trenches of it, and you're not flinching. And Rachel, your point about how love is so often seen as like an interruption or like a tangent on the ambitious path to individual success is so interesting to me, especially given that all 3 of you are writing these books that must have taken extraordinary isolation and individual sort of determination. And I wonder if that affected the relationships in your life at all.
Yeah, I think that writing is so strange in that you do need isolation, but you also need community. Like, I would not be able to write books without my fellow writers because nobody else quite understands why it's so important to you. I mean, there are plenty of people who, and not the people at this festival, of course, but there's plenty of people who are just like, why would you spend years of your life doing this? There's no logical explanation. Like, you need fellow writers who understand why it's so important and why it means so much to you. I think ideally relationships, like the relationships you're in, understand that too, or at least tolerate it. I mean, I think that's something that I was thinking about as you both were talking, just that I think our books are about love across difference too, across cultural difference especially, and often we're trained in how we love other people by our societies and by our cultures, and then when you're in specific relationships, you have to sort of navigate that and see, okay, what am I going to take? What am I going to like set aside because we don't need that here? And I think that's what I don't know, I just find so juicy, and like I want to write about that and not about not that this exists, but writing about a perfect relationship would not, I don't know if it would be that perfect if it were totally, frictionless and totally, chill. Like, does that exist? I don't think so. That might be just like a very some kind of relationship with a contract or with, I don't know. I don't know. It's just, like, I think in real human relationships, there's always mess.
Yeah. I don't think a perfect relationship exists without friction. And that would be so boring to read.
Yeah.
Nothing would be happening. There would be no tension. Yeah. For me, I think I want to echo what you said about community.
Yeah.
And I think that's so important because, like you said, no one else understands how vital it is, the writing, to our life. That sounds so dramatic, but for me at least, if I'm not writing, I'm so grumpy and I'm a lesser person in my daily life to the people around me, honestly. I can tell if it's been, even if it's been a week that I haven't been writing, I'm grumpier and less patient and just a different kind of person. So it behooves everybody around me that I have that writing time. And I think it is really essential to the way that I understand the world and process. And so it's something that I think I would do no matter what. And when you're writing a book, at least for me, I've never signed a contract for a book and then written it. So for me, when you're writing, you don't know if anyone's ever going to read it. You don't know if it's going to get published. It's because you really want to see the final shape of what you have created. And for me, I want to know what happens to the characters. I want to know what structural form makes the book feel complete. All of that is something that I just want to know for myself, and it keeps me going. Yeah.
Yeah, I think isolation is, it is just an enormous part of writing. You have to sit alone in a room. Even if you're at a cafe and you theoretically have people around you, I can't write like that. But you're still alone in your head. And I think that, I agree about community, but I think that what I would add to that is having other writers is really important, but I think for me it's a small number of writers is the only number I can really cope with when I'm actually writing a book, because it's really scary. It's you don't know whether what you're writing is going to be published, and I think when you're first writing, certainly for me, it always feels breakable. For both books that I've written, it was really only towards finishing the first draft that I could even admit that I was writing a book. I would at all other times just sort of say, I'm writing something, I don't know what it is. Don't ask me any questions about it. But I have, what I now have is a really incredible writing group we meet every week, and it's the same 7 people, and we've been meeting for about 5 years. And they are I owe them this book, certainly. I owe them a lot of stuff, because they're consistently there and consistently are going to tell me when things don't work and when things do work. That is the most incredible gift I've ever been given as a writer, is just that particular group of people. But certainly when I was writing this book, going to readings got kind of scary, because I was I don't want to talk to somebody who's just finished a book. Is the worst, absolutely not the person you want to talk to when you are struggling with writing the first draft of your own. And I definitely went towards finishing this book where I couldn't read anything published within the last 5 years, because I was too scary. It's just too frightening. So I think that would be, I think that's about preserving mental space. And I don't think that everybody else is like this necessarily, but I do know that I am like that.
So moving from the question of love to the question of anger, the characters in these books experience an enormous amount of anger of various kinds. Anger at their families, at their circumstances, at a dying world. Crystal, you described one of your characters as, quote, not understanding the architecture of his grief, grasping for the bright barrel of anger instead. Can you all talk about how anger is useful for both a character and for a novelist?
Good question. I feel like I'm drawn to writing characters that have some sort of rage inside them because that's really interesting to me. And I also think that I present as very like happy, and like a question that I often get when writing this book is like, how did you write this book? You seem so bubbly. I truly have gotten that question multiple times, and I never really know how to answer it. And it's probably, the answer is like, because I have a deep, dark soul. But yeah, I think I'm drawn to like sharp characters, especially sharp, independent, spiky women, because I think they make for interesting fiction. And of course, if you're put into a reformatory center, there's going to be rage there, right? At your circumstances, at however you got into that institution, at the people around you. So I think there are all these like layers of anger in the book, and that was, for me, easy to write, to be honest. But what was harder was to figure out how to imbue the book with community and hope, because that was something that I knew the novel needed and knew was essential to survival from my research and from talking to Han Jong-san, that in order to survive in a center where you don't know when you don't know when you will leave, it requires an incredible amount of faith, right, in community and the future and in humanity. So that was, I think, harder for me to access, and I worked really hard on that in the book, and the rage came a little easier. I think your second part is really interesting. You said, how does that help you? How does rage help writers? Mm-hmm. I have to think about that one. Someone else go.
Well, I think you sort of touched on this earlier. I think all of my characters would have been helped by therapy, and they should have gone to therapy, but that wouldn't have been an interesting book, and they had to sort of just work it out by by living. I don't know. Like, I think that like all of the stuff that we are ashamed of and we try to keep, buried or hidden, that's the interesting stuff. And that's the stuff that I want to write about. And so it just feels so essential to fiction and to just like the project of writing. Like, I think that writing is the deepest conversation I get to have with other people. And I've thought about this recently. It's kind of weird because like I picked a very weird form of communication. And when you write the book, you are having the conversation with yourself years before the reader gets to have that other end of the conversation with you. So it's this sort of delayed kind of connection, but at the same time, it's so rich because like the reader gets to complete the book that you have sort of started to imagine. So I think that if that's sort of the contract, if that's like what we're doing with each other, I want to be writing about the stuff that that like feels really essential to what it means to be a human being. And yeah, I think there is something really cool about the fact that we're like, back to the isolation thing, like I'm writing in isolation, the reader is reading in isolation. You might have a writing group or a book club or something, but like fundamentally like that, like you're just like interacting with the text on your own. And I think that's just so intimate and like so interesting, and that should be, at least to me, like I wanna read a book that's like really gets in it, and that just really like turns over all the stones. Yeah.
I think to that point, I certainly have, like, as a human being, a difficult time feeling anger, even though I actually get people telling me that I seem quite angry. But I don't feel it. Usually if I feel like negative emotions, I usually just feel sad. But I have the face that I have, I guess. But the thing that sometimes I've thought a lot about whenever I've felt like I should quit writing and go to law school, is like there's a particular thing that writing, and I think writing fiction can do that no other art form can do, and forgive me because I said this to a class just before this, so anybody who was in that class will be about to hear the same thing. But what you can do with writing that you can't do with any other medium is be inside the head of somebody else. Like you can't do that in film and you can't do that in music. You can do it a little bit, but not as deeply and not as much. And you can really feel what it is like to inhabit another person. And I think because I don't feel very good at feeling anger, the things that, like the things that the actual anger that I have, that's what's able to come out in the writing to some extent, because it is always so much more complex and complicated, and you can't explain it in an elevator pitch. I can't explain it in, I can't put it into a 3-minute song. I can't put it on a painting. Like, I have to be able to tell you in words, and I have to be able to tell you in all of the words it takes to tell you. And it ends up being like this many words. And I think that there is a lot of anger in that. There's also, I think sometimes there's this idea that writing is cathartic, and I don't feel that to be the case. I've never felt like relief or catharsis, or that I've like gotten something off my chest at the end of writing a book. But what I have experienced as a reader is catharsis, like having an emotional connection with a book and feeling like a writer has, reached through their brain to my brain and gripped it, and I've cried or I've laughed or something. And that's the thing that I feel like can happen, and that I'm trying to achieve, is like having some kind of cathartic effect and having a relationship with the reader on the other side, who, for the most part, I will never talk to and never meet, and I don't know that relationship is I don't know that effect is happening. But I think that the ability to generate and hold those really intense emotions is a thing that I think literature can do that other things, film, music, they don't do that in the same way.
Yeah. So for both of you, for all of you, this is your second novel, after extremely well-received first novels. And Rachel, I read an interview that you did with Crystal for The Rumpus, in which you talk about the joys and pitfalls of the sophomore novel. And you both mentioned wanting to stretch yourselves, to do something beyond what you thought you were capable of. Can you all talk about what new freedoms, but also perhaps psychological barriers you felt upon returning to the blank page for these second books?
Yeah. Should I go first?
Yeah, sure.
I think for me, when I started the second novel, I was really frustrated because by that point, I knew the first novel so well, and I knew all those characters so well and intimately, and every day I had to turn to a blank page and feel like, who are these people? Like, why is it so hard? I think there's a belief that after you write your first book, the second book will definitely be easier, right? That's what I think, at least I went into the writing thinking, and then I realized it is not easier. It's difficult, right? The writing is difficult. I think for me, I just had a greater sense of confidence, underlying confidence, like I knew I could finish a book. But like you referenced, I did want to stretch myself. So, I wanted to, craft-wise, my first book took place over 16 years. In this book, it's really condensed to 1 year. The first book had 5 narrators. So craft-wise, I had all of these different parameters that I wanted to stretch myself to try. And so, of course, the writing is going to be difficult every day. But that's the fun of it, I guess. That's what makes it interesting. I don't think I would be writing if it was easy. I wouldn't write if I knew what the story was. I wouldn't write if I knew the ending. I like the experience of coming to the page and not knowing exactly what's going to happen next, so that it feels like a discovery. And then when I look back on the pages, I can see like, oh, this is an interesting theme that I didn't even know I was exploring, but my subconscious did. So to me, that's what makes writing so essential and hard and amazing. Yeah.
I think I felt a lot of time pressure, because once you're once my first book came out, it felt like, oh, the clock was ticking and I needed to put out a second book. But books take time, and especially the way I write, which is just without any kind of plan. I'm sort of discovering as I go along, and the characters are surprising me along the way. But also you have to live life, and that goes into your work too. And so, yeah, I think I just felt like, the sort of like pressures of capitalism and like where's your next book? I don't know, and it wasn't coming from anybody else necessarily. It was really the sort of like internalized clock that I had. And I think that, I don't know, I don't really think that like rushing through writing a book is what I'm interested in actually. And I think I've come, like I'm at peace with that now because I do think maybe it just takes me 5 to 7 years to write a novel, like a few years to figure out what it's even about, what I'm even thinking about, and then a few more years to like actually make it happen. And I think, I don't know, like I just kind of want to lean into that. Like that's it's sort of outside, even though the book is this like physical product, it's a thing that you can buy at a bookstore. It also exists, it's art, like it's existing outside of this like, outside of commerce really, and that's like, I don't think about the value of a book when I read a book and I love it, right? I'm like, oh, that was $28 well spent. It's like, oh my God, this person like reached into my soul, as you're saying, and like they saw me, or they've experienced something that I needed to read, and so like that's what I think we're all trying to create, right? And that's not really on a timeline, but publishing and just like the fact of books can make you feel like you are on one.
I think I also felt like the pressures of capitalism. I felt like, got to write a second one. Like, they'll forget you if you don't. One of the things that I found with this book was I started writing it, there was a break between my book coming out in the UK and Australia and it coming out in the US. And I started writing this book in between that time. And so when it came out in the US, I was being interviewed about the first book while I was beginning to write this. And I was being asked these questions again that I was like, I should have answers to these questions. And I realized I just didn't have very good answers to a lot of the questions I was being asked about my first book. And that first book, like this one, also deals with climate change. It also deals with like millennials and like kind of unformed selfhood and ideas of emergency and things like that. And as I was being asked these questions and feeling like I didn't have good answers for them, I would come away from those interviews and feel really frustrated and like I hadn't spoken well, and then be like, well, what is my answer to this question actually? Like, what if the thing that I wrote in the first book isn't actually an answer to the question that is being posed to me, and what would that answer be? And so and then I would think about it, and that's what this book ended up becoming. So it was answering questions about form and about like what kind of emotions I was interested in conjuring, and what kind of structure I was interested in writing, and that became to some extent really freeing, because it did feel it was still incredibly difficult, and I was still really worried that like it would never get published and nobody would want to read it. But it did also feel like I felt like I had more of a sense of what I was doing this time around than I did in the first book, where I felt like I was just sort of sitting at a laptop every day and like vibing. This time was like I had a plan.
I love the point you made, Rachel, about the intersections of art and commerce and time. It's like, yes, these books cost $28, and yes, they may take 10 hours to read, and yes, they may take 5 to 7 years to write, but the lasting impact of them in a human's brain and in their soul lasts so much longer than that, and exists beyond any cost at all. And that's what I get to take with me, having read them all, and that's what I would give to all of you, to go out and buy them and let them live in your souls. So join me in thanking these amazing women.